All right. We're back once again. Welcome into another episode of The Scenario Sports. I'm your host. I'm part of your hosting equation. Matt Whitener here. Thanks for having everybody back in. I'm not even going to delay getting into it. I forced him into the corner. He made his way back here for me this week. Jason Clinkscales, editor-in-chief, Sports Fan Journal, sports journalism connoisseur of many different avenues, back with us here again. Jason, what's going on, brother?
I'm trying to make it as always, man. Just some people say living the dream, but I don't know if anybody's living the dream right now these days. So yeah.
All dreams. Is it safe to say all dreams matter, but all dreams aren't created equal? I don't know.
That's definitely true.
Can I say all things matter? I've got my voting pin on, so I went and took care of that.
Hey.
It was remarkably easy. I learned a lot about the voting process here this year. And I think timed very well to do so. But I wish I would have figured this out in college. I never changed my address to when I was in Columbia, having to go to St. Louis for my non-local people. That's about 2 hours apart. So I always have to find a way to go back until Obama in 2008, and I figured it out then. But I missed so many elections. It was so easy to do it. So I'll say this. We're not going to talk about politics, obviously, but I will say, voting deadlines vary based on where you're at. You do have a little bit more bandwidth on the other side to do things like absentee ballots or things of that nature. Every state varies, but whatever it takes, make sure that you do it. Be involved, stay involved. Don't just vote for president, vote for everything. There's a lot of things on the ballot. There's a lot of places you can go to. One that really helped me put over was vote411.org or .com. One of them, vote411, you'll bump into it. Breaks down your ballot based on where you're at and what you need to look at. Whatever side of the aisle you're on, it's there. Be involved. Have your voice be heard. With that, I'll just say, vote, do what you got to do, make it be a thing. So with that, though, there's plenty of things we didn't get to last week that I wanted to bring back in, man, and put on the table for you. I know there's a lot that you wanted to talk about as well. We'll get to the NBA Finals a little bit later. Obviously, that's probably the big thing that's on the plate right now, but there's a lot of other things that I know that were on your mind that we wanted to get to. And I'm going to take you to a place whose relationship I just kind of love to see you kind of out with, and I'll put it in a kind way. Let's go to the National Football League. And,
yes.
And the reason why I want to go to the NFL off tops is one thing that we've both been monitoring is how these seasons are progressing in various sports and what the environment has looked around it. And obviously the dominant story this week in the NFL has been the COVID outbreaks that were inevitable, but have shaped, part of week 4 and then definitely are impacting week 5 and potentially beyond right now. So, just kind of getting into it, we talked a little bit about offline. We talked a little bit about the bubble and the impacts of those things and how well it served the NBA, but how the NFL, as usual, goes against the grain of that and what that's looked like. So what have been some of your takeaways from the plight of the Tennessee Titans? Maybe we start right there, the cancellation, the postponement, I should say, of the Patriots and Chiefs game and just where we are going into week 5.
Well, let me go back to the earlier spontaneous topic, if you will, very quickly, not to get super political, but don't just vote in this election, vote in every election, vote in your state and the local elections every single year, and fill out the damn census. We still have a little more time, so please fill out that census. If you haven't done it, it takes you 10 minutes or less, and trust me, it is worthwhile, especially you hope that there aren't any changes in the way that your city, your town, your state receives funding from the federal government. So make sure you fill out the census as well. In relation to, I only laugh because I think we all predicted that the NFL would sort of have these issues. And I also want to be fair to the league in saying that there are people who are trying to sort of navigate this. I don't think this is I don't think it's every single person there who is being irresponsible or arrogant or anything like that when it comes to this virus. I mean, you cannot be. But what I will say about what's going on with the NFL is they've had so much lead time to not just decide how they're going to proceed, but they've had the lead time to watch what the NBA has done, what the NHL has done, what the WNBA has done, what Major League Soccer did with their season start tournament. They've had the privilege of watching NASCAR get started. They've had the privilege of watching international leagues getting started and figuring out what's going to work and what's not going to work. And I understand in some ways why they felt like they couldn't do a bubble, because they probably, I'm sure there are some people who are already just thinking like, we have guys in this league that may not exactly be the most emotionally stable individuals. We have to be honest about this part. I imagine they're probably saying like, all right, and not say they're all crazy or whatever else, but we have a lot of guys who are young, who are a little bit impulsive and a little bit reckless at times, even if they're not doing illicit behavior, but they're just young men. So I imagine they probably just sat there and said to themselves, if we put these guys in the bubble and we're talking about, close to 1,000 people when it comes to the teams, when it comes to the players, when it comes to the coaching staffs, when it comes to other personnel for 32 teams around the league, to try to do 1 or 2 or maybe even 4 bubbles and force people to be in this environment, and knowing how physical the game is and knowing the emotional toll the game takes on them on top of whatever things are going on off the field. I imagine they probably thought about this to say the bubble may not exactly be the best idea unless we have a crap load of psychologists on hand, unless we have all these sort of different personnel on hand. So I imagine there were a lot of logistical things in not going towards a bubble that they didn't want to take part in. Mm-hmm. However, I guess my anger about this situation is that these other leagues decided to take this chance, and they had the buy-in from their players and from their coaches. They've had the constant conversations to say, listen, we want to play these games. We want to finish our season in the case of the NBA or the NHL. We want to get our season started in the case of MLS and some of these other leagues, the WNBA. There was a constant conversation on both sides between management/ownership and the players/players union. The conversations we saw or we heard about in the NFL did not have that same fruitfulness. And as my son says, hi, yes, you're going to watch Chip and Potato? Sorry. You can edit that if you want. I don't care. By the way, everybody.
Oh, let it roll. I think that a fully acceptable part of the world we're in right now is interactions of various people in homes during product. We roll it.
You're all going to meet my
on the Straight Out Lowcash Network, man. We roll it the way it goes.
Hey, listen. You all probably going to somehow, some way meet my son through this whole thing. So that'll be great. He's almost 2 years old and he's great, and he's very excited about the TV show he's watching on my phone right now. So yeah. But back to what I was saying, I think that again, my anger is that the conversations were fruitless and they've had so much time to sort of progress and things never progressed for whatever reason. And when you see that, I think back to the NHL bubble, which I personally think was the most successful bubble of all. The NBA is very successful, but I think the NHL had a very successful one in where they went to 2 different cities. They decided we're going to commandeer a couple of hotels and commandeer a couple of areas that probably needed the business. And yeah, there have been some stories about the players probably not exactly loving the environment all the time, but by and large, everyone understood the buy-in that needed to be had here. There are so many areas around the country that the NFL could have used, and hotels that are near some, or there was hospitality near some of these stadiums that they could have used. And the fact that those conversations didn't happen in order to get to those venues, the fact that the conversations didn't happen to ensure the players would sort of be financially prepared, because I think that was another end of this thing. It's like, well, there's always a financial implication with this, as we saw in baseball. There's always other factors that just didn't come into play, it seems, from our standpoint, that they're reaping what they're sowing right now. Yeah. I think when you have, in having a bubble, you can actually organize your practices a lot more. You can have an eye on these venues. You can have an eye on things. Maybe it'd be a little bit extra surveillance that some players may not want. But in order for things to progress the way they hope, like this needed to happen, and it didn't happen. I think if you had a bubble, a situation like what you have in Tennessee, where you have, at last I heard, it was like 23 players tested positive and 23 staff.
I think that as of, we're recording this on Thursday afternoon, it was up to 24, I think, at that time. Okay. And really, and I'm glad you bring that up, is because the terms under which that happened, you talk about players being in the open, for lack of a better term, people being in the open, being able to have that autonomy that, I look at and I think about, thing I the biggest risk. And, come to find out that yesterday it was revealed that they were still conducting workouts and still playing at a local area high school, which is just
and that's the thing, right? Let's see. When Tom Brady officially signed with Tampa Bay, there was a seemingly funny story about him and several players in the Buccaneers trying to get some practice time at a high school football field in the Tampa area. Yeah, it was a little funny because we all thought it was sort of like a nice lighthearted thing, but there was a little seriousness of these guys are trying to get their chemistry going. They're trying to get their reps in. Again, you had at the time where they could have, even if this is for training camp, at the time that the NFL had, again, watching everybody else sort of going through their bubbles, the NFL could have said, if we pick, say, 4 to 6 cities, whatever, well, maybe about 4 cities, maybe 8 if they want to go there, but 4 to 8 cities, we place a whole division here, we place like these random teams here, and we could have said, if you guys want to have your practice, you could use these high school facilities, which are not being used at the moment. You could use these college facilities, which are not being used at the moment, in order to conduct your practices. Everybody's going to play their games here. We're going to start at a certain time in the morning and run this through the evening. They could have done these things so that players and coaches didn't feel like they would never get their reps in. They wouldn't get their conditioning.
And then that also alleviates.
That's what frustrates me.
That also alleviates the feel that people have to take things into their own hands to be
right.
on, and I think Ryan Tannehill, Titans quarterback, had statements yesterday saying, it's like, I got to get my throws in. I got to do what I got to do. They're a team that right now, because we did start the season underneath the terms of we did, they're 3-0. They're playing for something. They've got this in their mind. And the thing we all know about athletics, and we think that anybody that's not just, stuck their head in a book and is only paying attention to the statistics of the game, is momentum matters. And when it's gotten started, it's gotten rolling, and they've gotten to where they're at. And, with a team like the Titans, let's not forget how close they were to getting over the hump and being in the Super Bowl last year.
Right.
They're carrying those feelings back, and that emotional capacity of the game does matter. So, they feel like they need to do this to keep an edge as they're looking at the other teams they're competing with, continuing to have that edge, staying out there doing that. And they're looking at it as this is a disadvantage for us. We're going to fall behind. So because of that lack of preparation and that lack of access, you kind of put them in a position where they're fending for themselves too. And that's not where you want their head to be.
They're very much like the rest of the country right now. In a lot of ways, it's very reminiscent to how, the country by and large has handled the pandemic. It's not that I want to compare their particular situation to the gravity of, the everyday person, or even just like I say this because I'm here in New York, but like what my city's gone through. It's not to the same degree. And fortunate and blessedly so far, we're not talking about a loss of life or anything like that. Nothing that great. But there is this sense of being out there on your own, because I don't know if they did this because they felt like they didn't trust the NFL's leadership, and I imagine that's probably the case because, as we've seen over the years, players really don't trust Roger Goodell and the league office. I don't know if there is a sense of, to your point, the competitive nature that they have, this sense of we're 3-0, we have a chance to do something special. Maybe things would be differently if they were 0-3. I'm sure that's the case there. And let's not forget, Ryan Tannehill signed a new deal in the offseason, but we have in a roster of close to 60 guys. Not everybody's making the millions that he's making. So there are certainly some players who are saying, in addition to us being 3-0, I have to keep myself sharp in order to make sure that I can get paid.
How much in that situation, though, do you take it to Mike Vrabel? How much of it, we have said what we said about the league, we said about the players' desires, but how much of it comes down to institutional control, and how much of it comes down to the fact that keeping an eye on the bigger picture? And now, like we've seen in the past with the league, they're always willing to a certain extent, throw a hammer when there's been something they have to punish. Not necessarily acting proactively, but now they have to punish. And now it sounds like there could be any number of sanctions that are going to get put forward, once again putting Roger Goodell in that same situation of, being that commissioner that's inconsistent. But in this regard, he's having to be inconsistent because the returns are coming from a place of the unknown and have inevitable consequences that could happen.
I think here's the thing, like, you don't want to say he's blameless because he's really not. I mean, this is your team. You are the, I don't like when people say that the head coach is the CEO of the team, but you are pretty much the head honcho of the franchise outside of actual management and ownership. You are the person who is dealing with all your coaches and your players and whatnot. And whatever communication was lacking from his end to make sure the players understood, like, yo, you cannot do certain things. That has to be addressed in some degree, not just with the team, not just the Titans management, but also the league itself. So, there is going to be a certain sanction against him, and in all likelihood, because if somebody's head's got to fall, it can't just be the players. It's got to be somebody else. So,
right.
We'll find out who, whether it's him, whether it's Vrabel himself or members of the coaching staff, who falls in their swords, if you will, because somebody's going to. Somebody in the coaching staff is going to fall.
And it sounds like, for the sake of what I've heard so far, it's going to be the organization. The organization is going to be the one that takes the hits.
And that's what I wanted to get to more than anything else.
Sure.
Ownership. And as we've learned with the NFL, for better or for worse, owners may love certain players. They will love the guys at the top of the roster they're paying the most money to, at least in the current season. But by and large, they don't really care as long as you are performing and you are winning.
Mm-hmm.
And
ROI, return on investment. I mean, that's what it is, when you're at that level.
And with the somewhat reduced return on investment, because you don't have fans coming to your stadium right now, and you can't get that revenue.
Yeah.
Well,
it depends.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it does depend. I mean, and I know Tennessee is going through the ups and downs when it came to this, when it comes to COVID, but still, they're not dealing with the same sort of financial windfall that they would have in a normal season.
Absolutely.
But that said, this is a franchise that has had a history of sort of a middle finger to the NFL in their different ways, especially their late patriarch Bud Adams, literally flipping a finger during the game, which is still, to me personally, one of the funniest moments in league history. But anyway, the Titans definitely have to follow their sword in this one, because you understand that your actions, the actions of your players and your coaches, and indirectly of yourselves as franchise owners and as management, have a massive impact on the entire league. As a 3-0 team, as a team that had, as a team that was considered one of the best in this past season and going into this season, you're a team that everybody's looking out for. You're a team that, as the season gets late and, if you're still performing at this high level, your team is the one everybody's going to be watching on television.
Mm-hmm.
And if they can't play because your team decides to take things on your own hands, everyone's going to make sure you pay for it. And that just has to be the case. You understand that you can't just act above the law. Hell, when the New England Patriots, who have their own issues, when they're not exactly going as far as you have, that tells you got a problem. So
and I think that the thing about it is, that's a great point, because now you're starting to mess with other people's destinies too.
You're messing with everybody's money.
The Buffalo Bills are another one of the hottest teams in football, and this weekend the Titans were scheduled. I mean, nothing's called off yet. I don't see how it moves forward, but you're going to have a matchup of undefeateds for the second time, because Steelers haven't lost yet either. And, so for the second time in 2 weeks, you've got kind of the dominoes of the league are being impacted by how this disease has hit this one team. And
you were impacting. I'm sorry. I just want to interject real quick, because you impacted the league in terms of a competitive standpoint. And while, yes, the broadcasting deals are set, this, that, and the other, you're impacting the entire ecosystem of television, actually, when you really think about it. Now, locally, you're asking, and postponing the game, that local market, those local markets, and in particular, maybe a national thing, depending on what the game is, they cannot have a game as aired as normal. So therefore, those networks cannot make the revenue back from the game to help continue their operations. So you're messing with other teams competitively and somewhat financially. You're messing with the network's ability to air games. You're messing with a whole lot of features, a lot of functions here and there. And again, while we're not talking about the same sort of money when it comes to attendance in stadiums, we are talking about the potential of networks trying to get some sort of a reduction because they couldn't air a game. All these sort of hypotheticals are coming into play now that nobody's really thinking about. And I don't think it's going to be just the teams are going to ask for some sort of a punishment against the Titans. I think it's going to be a lot of the league partners, local partners are going to be asking for some sort of a give back based on what the Titans have decided, taking things upon their own hands this way. So this has such a wider reaching effect than people may realize right now, but we're not thinking about this because we're thinking about this from a competitive standpoint on the field, fantasy purposes for you fantasy football owners, and just straight up like, political purposes and what's going on in the league. Like, there's
Well,
all
I'm
these
damn
factors
sure
that come into
thinking
play.
about it. I'm damn sure thinking about it from the fantasy standpoint, because last week I lost Derrick Henry, I lost James
Yeah.
Conner, I lost Ben Roethlisberger, and I
Money's
lost
on the line for people. Plain and
yes,
simple.
money is on the line, pride, all sorts of things. I am personally very put off by this, but and I'm glad that you bring that up about that angle about television and things like that, because I know that another one of your passions is ratings and the perception of the game, the business of the game, that side of it. And one thing that stood out to me is that in this one instance this week, you were able to see a quick pivot. So on Monday night, there is the crown jewel of the NFL week is Sunday Night Football, Monday Night Football. Those are the places that they really go to with the Sunday slate obviously carrying the value that it does. But when you talk about where the true revenue drivers are at and the big packages, it's Sunday night and it's Monday night.
Absolutely.
Those are the places that people are fighting to get to. So on Monday, what you see instead is that what would have been the CBS prime afternoon game on Sunday gets moved into like a quasi Monday Night Football role between with the Patriots and the Chiefs being on Monday night. Game itself, at best, but it was another game that was put out there. So I'm going to throw this at you. Is that something that CBS kind of looks at and says, boy, I got eyes on my station I wouldn't have gotten otherwise? Maybe this isn't a complete L for me? Or is it something that ESPN looks at and says, hey, you're taking people away from the first hour of my game because of this?
Well, here's the thing that, first of all, on CBS point of view, and I'll be fair enough, slight disclosure, I was a former employee for the Interactive Group for about a year or so. And, I don't necessarily have the best relationship with that network, but that said, when it comes to their programming, I know they purport themselves to have like some of the top programming in all of television. They had some supposedly successful comedies, this, that, and the other, but they had no problem dropping all that stuff in the drop of a hat to bring in these eyeballs. Not a problem whatsoever. I don't think there's a television network, there's not a media company on the planet that would say, hey, we're going to keep on we want to keep on our comedy block or even our syndicated entertainment shows or news. They're not going to do
nothing. There is nothing that you could offer a network that's like NFL football.
Nothing. So they definitely got eyeballs that they wouldn't have gotten. Now, granted, that meant they'd have to do some juggling in terms of scheduling. I used to help with some of the scheduling decisions for a couple of different TV networks, and I know that was not exactly the easiest thing for them to do. But when it came to that money, it was all right. When it came to those eyeballs and getting some advertisement, because that's really what it comes down to. It's the game could do whatever the game does, but the advertisements can actually get more eyeballs than they normally would. And then those advertisers in turn would actually go ahead and put more money into the programming for the network. So that was the opportunity for them to make sure they had those eyeballs on there, and it worked out well. Yeah, there was no issue with that. ESPN certainly probably took a hit in the beginning, but then I think what it is, here's the thing about, when people talk about ratings and viewership, not everybody watches TV the same way. Not everybody has the same exact habits. Some people, and I'm sure there may be a couple million people who decided, all right, now I got a doubleheader of football. I'm going to watch this from beginning to end. At 7:30 East Coast time, I'm going to watch the first game, and then I'm going to watch all the way to the end of ESPN's,
It was like a 6-hour quasi Sunday.
Yeah, and there are some people who are definitely going to do that. No question about it. There are also enough people, and I think most people in the United States, flip channels, even during the games they love, even during the biggest events, they're flipping channels. So everybody's doing that. ESPN is probably certainly mad because now that option was sort of taken away from them in the beginning. We're like, all right, people are really going to just wait until the CBS game finishes before they come into ours. And unless the game is a blowout, just those eyeballs are being gone. It wasn't just being gone from the first half of the game. It was also from the first part of the game. It was also eyeballs that were taken away from the pregame shows. It was eyeballs taken away from even just at the end of the night, the pregame shows. Because somebody's saying, I'm tired. I'm not going to watch all this anymore.
And it wasn't like the Jaguars and the Dolphins got flexed. It was Pat Mahomes versus the New England Patriots. Like, it's not like a thing. The Super Bowl champions being on TV in a primetime slot with a fan base like theirs and a name like that, that's just not a regular game that had to get made up. if we were talking about, obviously we talked about what the Titans mean and what the Bills, the start they've gotten off to, that might not be as much of a joust for attention against Aaron Rodgers being on ESPN as that game was. I mean, that's a big shift, and obviously just the nature of interest for people is going to be at a higher level for that.
And well, here's the thing with CBS, because I reached out. I check out. There's a site that I go to pretty often, run by my good friend John Lewis, called Sports Media Watch. And he put up numbers and analysis of what actually was happening for CBS and ESPN. So that Monday night game that was supposed to have been Sunday night for CBS. So that's on Sunday for CBS. Obviously, it did a lot better than it would have done even in the afternoon. So It had 14.6 million viewers on CBS, which would have been more than, he says here, Monday's, let me just read it off. It's better to do that. Monday's Patriots-Chiefs NFL game, which was originally scheduled to lead Sunday night's late doubleheader window, but was pushed back a day, averaged 8.3 rating and 14.6 million viewers on CBS. Kansas City's win nearly matched. This is the important part here. So, one, it matched the previous night's Sunday night game from NBC, which was the Eagles and the 49ers, which had, it did close to that, about 15.8 million, 15.08 million for Sunday Night Football. Now, the thing was for CBS, this gave them the largest primetime audience since a presidential primary debate back in February.
Okay.
So we're talking about going back to February 25th, before the pandemic really began. 15.34 million people watched that Democratic presidential primary back on February 25th. So this is CBS's best performing show of the year. I don't like saying shows, but this is their best performing window of the entire year. Yeah, they took it, they loved it, and that was that. It did impact it apparently did hit Monday Night Football because their start time was pushed back, which is the other part that played a role. Start time was pushed back 45 minutes. They only had 8.65 million viewers, which was down 17% from a matchup same time a year ago. So, yeah, it definitely was an impact.
Do we know who played in that game a year ago in Week 4?
That game a year ago was Cincinnati and Pittsburgh.
Oh, that's not good.
Yeah. And it was a loss of close to 2 million viewers versus a year before. I prefer personally
let's sprinkle some real life into this thing, too. Let's sprinkle some real life into this.
Sure.
Because also at the same time, if you're anybody like me, if you're like me, I watch the slate. I watch the games on Sunday. I watch both sides of it. I'll watch a little bit of Sunday night. I wouldn't say that I get sports fatigue, but my household definitely probably does. So if you tried to watch 2 games on Monday after watching that, you've got other factors, whether it's kids in some regards, whether it's work, whether you've got a wife who's like, all right, enough is enough. We don't need to watch which could be in her particular mind, or in some people, their husband's particular mind who doesn't care about the NFL, be like a 5th round of football this week. So, I mean, you're going to lose people because of that,
it's a lot.
And that going back to what we were talking about is what some of the risk that comes into play for the NFL. Because when you start to look at, the fact that some of these games, they might, I know for a fact we're going to have a Tuesday NFL game this year. That you'll have multiple Thursday games potentially that you have to do just because of where this thing is at. And to bring the whole thing we've talked about full circle a little bit, the NFL had the chance, had the benefit of, with everything that's happening with COVID and everything that's going into it, to have the largest foresight for their league because their season was the furthest away. Even when we were talking about what this was going to look like and how it was going to play out, the league, we said that they've got the chance to get this right the most is the NFL because there'll be so many examples ahead of them. One example that was there was Major League Baseball. And you had 2 severe outbreaks in Major League Baseball with the St. Louis Cardinals and with the Miami Marlins. Both of those teams had to play just hellacious slates of makeup games in order to make that work. Now, in baseball, that was doable, although it absolutely did impact the quality of those teams. And I think that it's remarkable that the Marlins are still playing right now and that the Cardinals made it to the brink of being into the regular postseason slate because they had to play so many doubleheaders and 14 innings of baseball a day and do that. In football, that's not an option. You are not playing a doubleheader of football. You're probably, I think that the margin of safety is already stretched by having people play a Thursday game after a Sunday game. So the balancing act is one that it's a house of cards. this thing can come falling in on itself because you simply can't make it up. One option you've got is to continue to move back the end of the season, which you could do. But then once again, let's get back to what we were talking about with advertising and with everything that goes into it. The Super Bowl is the mecca of advertising and set dates. It's the biggest advertising / sports event of the year in the world, period. There's nothing from the dollars and the investments that go into the Super Bowl that are anywhere close. So while you talk about some flexibility with bye weeks, with playoff schedule and things like that, you still do have somewhat of a hard end date due to the commitments that are in play with the Super Bowl. I mean, am I wrong?
Well, yeah, they're the commitments, but also keep this in mind, and I do want to reach back to the earlier point with CBS, right? Part of the reason why it was also easy for CBS to sort of, move the, push to move the day of the Patriots and Chiefs game to Monday night is because I wrote about this in my newsletter earlier back in the summer, how the entire media ecosystem in the United States and probably the world, but the entire media ecosystem is dependent on live sports, whether we like it or not. Whether it's as a revenue generator for the networks and the media companies, as a stable, ideally stable place for programming purposes, as the tent poles for a lot of these networks.
It's the last. It's the last bastion of destination TV.
Of live destination TV, but it was also equally important. It was even more important this year because of the scripted schedule has been impacted by COVID, because production of certain TV shows had to be delayed. Certain shows have been canceled so far, even from the streaming services, because of the COVID pandemic. So when you don't have your usual fall schedule coming in where you can push that and promote that to the high heavens, you have a dearth of real brand new original programming for people to go to in the first place. So sports becomes even more important as that stopgap on certain nights until you can get your programming back. And which is why, despite what people talk about the NBA and all this stuff, like the NBA is doing fine. And I mention that because when you say like this hard stop with the NFL when it comes to the Super Bowl, look, they may have to consider pushing that back because of everything that's going on, whether they like it or not. They have to in this case, and it shouldn't be that hard of a decision, because structurally, in terms of the infrastructure going on with, some of these, I forgot where the Super Bowl is supposed to be this year, but it's not as if they're going to open up these stadiums. Look, there's some logistical things right now.
No, it's not LA this year, is it?
I don't remember where it is this year, but here's the thing: it's not as if they're going to be. You're not going to have 100,000 people in the building this year anywhere in the world. You're not going to have that. You're not going to have the competition of other events to the same degree you would have had in normal years. Everybody used to have to schedule around the Super Bowl because of the amount of hotel space they would take up, because of the amount of business that takes up around a certain metropolitan region. You're not going to have that same competition. So they can easily push things back if they choose to. And they probably should, for the betterment of the league.
And I looked it up. It's LA. It's at SoFi Stadium this year.
You're not competing with anything. Flat out. You're not competing with anything. And even with the weather, you're not really competing with the weather in a retractable roof stadium. You're not competing with it. So, but when it comes to all these other factors, in order to, again, there's so many moving parts here that you're talking about, Matt, when it comes to the revenue generation, when it comes to the Super Bowl, when it comes to just regular games, that, I still think that because other programming is pushed back for these networks, I still think it's not that hard for the NFL to do that, because it actually throws a bone to these networks who need his sports right now. Yeah. And I think there needs to be these conversations. That's on the network side. In terms of the players and all that, when you mentioned, you're talking about Major League Baseball, and let's not forget, they had fought over money. Let's not forget that. They fought over money when it came to not having a bubble. When there was that conversation earlier in the summer about everybody having a bubble in Phoenix and in the Arizona area and trying to have all the teams there. I mean, they're kind of doing that now when it comes to the playoffs. Major League Baseball, the NFL certainly could have done the same thing, especially in some of these, not that they should be doing these hot spots, but they definitely could have done that in some of these southern-based areas. They could have done it in Arizona. They could have done it in California, well, to some degree. They could have done it in these states where, you have retractable roof stadiums, so you don't have to worry about the weather. You don't have to worry about crazy thunder like sometimes we do in the summer with the preseason games. You don't have to worry about high school football going on because you can use those as practice facilities since they're not playing high school football right now in a lot of places. Like they really could have done this in certain cities, in certain states. But it's just you and I are right now circling around this conversation because we can't get beyond how bungled this entire process is.
It all ties back into
Yeah.
one thing. It all ties back into one thing for me. It's a very simple straight line for me. It all goes back into the politics of belief. The politics of belief is what the biggest hindrance is to a number of things here. There's always going to be apprehension about money. There's always going to be the piece of action where it's reacting after the point, being like, is this something that we need to pay attention to? Is this something that we need to look at? How do we go about doing this? I think that this year, it's a show that a lot of people have a different relationship with, can take it or leave it. I thought that this year's Hard Knocks was one of the most interesting, fascinating looks behind the curtain.
I've heard it was very interesting.
In I've seen in sports. It was a look at not just teams trying to figure out how to bring themselves together. It was a look at a league trying to figure out how to restart itself. And that brings me to another thing that I want to get to is exactly what that looks like. Because the thing that I've said the entire time is that there's a big difference between some leagues here who were trying to finish up what they had started and leagues that were trying to get off the ground what they needed to get started with. I think that the NFL was one that we touched on every corner of that. We saw the struggle that baseball had. Baseball, regardless of what we think about with the NFL, the MLB and its fights with bubbling, with scheduling, versus how to justify what a season accounts for on the financial level, for all the different tiers that go into it. Baseball dropped the ball harder than any other league in sports this year.
Listen, I'm a little bit more engaged the postseason right now than I was the regular season because I was just so turned off and angry with how baseball conducted itself on both sides. This isn't just about the owners. This is also about the players as well and how they conduct themselves. And I think that's why I'm also frustrated with the NFL because they could have avoided a lot of these issues, but also they probably could have copied some of the issues. One thing I want to say this real quick before we get back to the baseball point of view. I do think that the owners probably also didn't want the contingency plan of having to increase their rosters and guarantee salaries in terms of making sure there would be a season that would be safe for everybody. I think that plays a role, and that's a whole different conversation. That probably is the reason why we are where we are. And so when I look at baseball, what they did was you're fighting over, are we going to prorate salaries? Are we going to expand the rosters in order to make sure that we can account for players who may contract the virus, but to continue on, have enough players on the roster that we can isolate those that actually are, need to be in quarantine, but then continue with the season that we have as normal. Baseball, to say they dropped the ball is being kind. They punted that thing. They pooped on it. They did a whole lot of things to that ball and just, it's just disgusting. And I think the NFL probably saw some of those issues and just said, well, let's just steal on it as we normally would, and we'll figure it out as it goes on.
The thing about baseball, too, though, is that, what's the thing you hear a lot about this pandemic is that this pandemic is putting a lot of people to have to spend time with each other in relationships who it's not the best relationship in the world. Now they've got to confront how bad it is. That's the story of baseball. That's exactly what baseball has been. Baseball was headed towards an inevitable stoppage of business that still is out there, still looming, that is going to happen after the 2021 season, no matter what happens. When this collective bargaining,
it's ugly.
When this collective bargaining agreement is over with baseball right now, baseball is going on the shelf, and they're going to have to figure out some hard truths about a lot of different levels of that business about how they're going to move forward, because there is a lot of inequities in baseball right now that work against the players, that have a lot to do with money not being shared, about how those things are being handled. And there's a lot to be said about it. We don't have to. That's a whole different avenue to go down that I'm sure we will get to eventually when this becomes a bigger thing. But what it did was it brought baseball's problems into the forefront right now. And it showed just how far apart those two sides are and how little they're willing to negotiate with each other on things. And this brings me to another area about what I wanted to get to, which is that leagues like the NHL and leagues like the NBA, who had the luxury of picking up the pieces for where a season was at, and a part of that doesn't get told a lot of the time is a lot of people in those leagues had already received their checks for the year. They were just finishing up the competitive part of it. But a lot of money had already been put up there. That's not going to be the case when we get to free agency that's starting right now with the NHL, where you have people that are going to be out in the market. They're going to be looking for money that might not be there. And then with the NBA, who's going to have to figure a path back in what is a very staggered season that's going to start. The NHL and the NBA, regardless of how their bubbles went and things like that, to the success they had, and I think there's no doubt saying that they were successful in being able to continue and finish their seasons, they're going to have new problems that come together now in getting those guys to agree to the terms about how they're going to start that, how they're going to start those seasons up again, and then how they're going to keep those players safe, because they're not going to be able to avoid these issues that the MLB and that the NFL have had to deal with in regards to player safety. As soon as they open up the bubble, it's all fair game again.
Well, what's interesting with the NHL, from what I've seen so far, first of all, they do plan. There was an announcement, I think yesterday, they said they plan to start their season January 1st.
Yes.
Right now, they just finished the NHL draft. They do plan to have the season January 1st. They're going to start their off season in earnest fairly soon. Which means they have to get back to some sort of training camp in December and all that.
I mean, hockey has like a 3-week off season anyway.
Right. They have a very short off season, but then also
it seems like it stops for less of a time than hockey is off.
Well, what's interesting though is they also mentioned, because we also, the thing to keep in mind with both the NBA and the NHL, but definitely much more the NHL, is there's the border concerns. The fact that Canada's closed off the United States. So, there's been discussion, I think, of an all-Canadian division, if you will, in the NHL, which would be very interesting. And then trying to figure out what they could do with the remaining teams here in the States. I'm sure they'll probably get some sort of travel thing figured out, because, while the Canadian side of the league is much more passionate by and large versus the American side, the money is still being drawn on both sides. They have to figure something out.
Are we at 6 Canadian teams right now?
It's still 7.
7, okay.
It's still 7. So, but there's still 31 teams in the league right now. 7 of them are Canadian, and the 32nd team, Seattle, obviously is not Canadian, but can build a strong Canadian rivalry between Vancouver and Calgary and Edmonton, and you can't forget the entrance of Vegas. There's a whole lot of things. Listen,
well, and you also have the dynamics of how that's going to work out for the expansion draft. That's imminent for the NHL as well.
There are a lot of pieces there, and the underrated aspect, I think, between both the NHL and the NBA, and in a slight extent the WNBA for a couple of teams, is that there are shared facilities between those leagues. If I remember my exact count, there were 8 cities between the 2 male leagues that share facilities. It's New York, Washington, Dallas, Boston, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, that's 6, Chicago, 7, and Toronto, that's 8. So those 8 cities that share, 17 teams between those 2 leagues. And then a WNBA, when you consider the Brooklyn Nets and the New York Liberty share facility as well. That plays a massive role in terms of player safety, in terms of the logistics between both leagues, and how you can protect all the players involved. So that's another reason why what those 2 leagues are going to do should be very important, and it's something to be mindful of, because a quarter of both leagues share facilities with another league. Do you remember the Mercer breakout that the NHL?
The Suns in Phoenix, do they share facilities there as well?
They do not. They do not. But there was, I think back a couple years ago when there was a Mercer outbreak in the NHL, which happened with, I think, the New Jersey Devils, the New York Rangers, I believe the Minnesota Wild. But with at least the Rangers, there was a concern about, well, could this impact the Knicks? Because obviously they both share MSG. And
how
other
many
outbreaks
people would have been upset if the Knicks were impacted by that disease and were unable to compete?
Don't get me started on that one, but but beyond that, but it's still just the logistical and the health nightmare that would have came from that. And that was just MRSA, which is a very serious disease in its own right. COVID,
but more severe. If you just want to, I don't believe in ranking those things, but when you look at the impact of what it did, that was one that if it was as widespread as COVID is, we would be well past the 1 million death mark by now.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Now, I mentioned that too because, those leagues have to figure things out in terms of the finances and all that. But I think because of the success of their bubbles and the understanding, and look, there's now some, based on based on what they've endured over the last few months, it's like there's some questions they can now answer. There are questions they probably had before they didn't have at the beginning that they have now. Again, the psychological welfare of the players and the coaches involved. The leagues will be able to answer that. But they now have an experience, and they have that understanding, again, the logistical aspect of both leagues sharing venues. They got to figure out the finances, and those are extremely important, but they also have, there are questions they're going to be able to answer, I think, in a larger degree, because they've had the experience, they had the previous buy-in. There's some new questions that are coming into play now they can answer, and they can answer both as individual teams, as individual leagues, and together, because they're going to have to do that. But I do think that, it's not going to be perfect, but they're going to figure something out because they had that shared experience. Baseball and football tend to be, I think, even culture-wise, somewhat isolating. Very unique sports because the nature of their sports. I think also the politics of the participants involved here, we cannot deny that. I do think that there are all these other things come into play with why their responses are so wildly different than what the NHL and all that and the NBA did. Yes, you're right, Matt. Those leagues were starting seasons, baseball and football, whereas the other two leagues were finishing seasons. And so for the leagues that were finishing their seasons, the buy-in was a little bit easier. But I do also think, I do think that there is the business natures of the leagues. Again, the shared facilities, the little bit more. You have owners who own leagues, who own teams in both leagues. I think they have a little bit more of that understanding, whereas in baseball and football, that's not the case per se. And so I do think that, the questions they have to answer in terms of the finances, they'll figure something out. It's not gonna be that easy. I know the NHL deals with like an escrow-ish. I know they escrow some of the salaries, and that's gonna be probably the most contentious part going to next season for the NHL. The NBA having to answer the questions about the CBA and all that stuff. Yeah, no doubt about it. So their issues are a lot more thorny, if you will. But I think in terms of a bubble, I think that the logistics of a season-long bubble, I think they'll be able to answer them more because they actually had the experience of the bubble this year.
Let's hope so. It's going to be a big piece of about if you're going to anything that's the closest of normalcy of sports you can see in 2021.
Yeah, I think they'll be able to get back there probably a little bit sooner. What I am interested in, however, the NBA, because they still haven't decided when they're going to start their season. They tend to start their season about 2 weeks after the NHL does. So I do wonder, while Adam Silver has pretty much just said like December's off the table in terms of starting the season, potentially January, I wonder if he's hedging his bets a little bit because, again, I really do think it's an underrated aspect of this. Shared facilities with the other league, which also means COVID protocols have to somewhat mirror.
Well, the NBA already, Adam Silver also said last week that NBA players most likely will not be participating in the Olympics. I think that was pretty much a given no matter what. So he's anticipating the league going into the summer, which I don't think is a bad thing for the, for the sports slate, is having more sports in the summer. That helps, that makes a difference. But that's going to be a developing story. I personally think that they need to abridge the season, get closer to 60 games, which would be more feasible than 82 if you want to try to get things back to normal in the fall. But we'll get there. There's a couple of other things I want to turn the corner and talk with you about while we're there with the NBA and a couple of other things. I know this is conversations we had. I wanted to get to. Actually, want to talk about it last week, but we went down some other pathways. Michael Jordan, NBA. Things of that nature, made the announcement about 2 weeks ago or so that he was going to be getting into the NASCAR arena, and his team was going to be headlined by Bubba Wallace, which is a really, really interesting outcome. Give me some quick thoughts about Michael Jordan moving into that and what it means for both the NASCAR culture and also for the larger culture of the sport.
I love it. I absolutely love it. And the thing is, I think – so two things with this. Well, actually multiple things, but two things with this. One, if you remember when he was playing baseball, when he retired that first time, he was playing baseball.
Michael Jordan played baseball?
Yeah, right. But when he was playing baseball at the Birmingham Barons and all that, I do remember at the Sports Fan Journal, I think we were using Slack then. We were having a conversation about what it could have meant for Michael Jordan to have gotten involved in baseball at that time. Like if he
Okay, wait
became
a minute. I
somewhat.
thought you were talking about a conversation we had at TSFJ when he was playing baseball. I was like, I
No,
think I was
no, no, no,
12.
no.
You guys definitely
No, I'm
were
sorry.
cooking
No,
earlier than
right,
me.
right, right, right. But we had a conversation about that at the time because I think Jordan Rides the Bus just aired
Yeah, 30 for
on
30.
ESPN, which I love. That was a great 30 for 30. And shouts to Terry Francona for that one as well. We had I remember there was a conversation somewhere about that, and I think I turned it into an article for TSFJ, wondering if Jordan ascended in baseball, what that could have done for the sport's black viewership and their black fan base at the time. Which, look, Ken Griffey Jr. was still the man, if you will, in terms of the mainstream. But Barry Bonds, who is arguably the better player, was really getting into his peak powers. This is obviously before Balco and all that. But there was still a
Oh,
somewhat.
I mean, if you talk about black baseball in the early '90s, blacks in baseball, that was the final pioneer. That was the final end
That
for
was it.
blacks
That
in
was the final
baseball.
stand. Yeah, that was the final
Frank Thomas
stanza.
was a two-time MVP at that time. Tony Gwynn was chasing 400. I mean,
Yeah.
the Atlanta Braves had plenty of black players on them.
Yeah.
You had your Kenny Lofton, your Albert Bells, all of that. So to add Michael Jordan to that potential scene, and even him being that close to the sport in general, helped it.
It helped.
It was a whole different thing.
Right. And the idea of more two-sport athletes, at a higher level two-sport athletes actually trying to make that move, that could have been something.
Sure.
But we had the conversation wondering, like, what would have happened if he actually got far enough in which it would have been noticed and he would have sustained it? Could he have brought more black kids playing the game and really paying attention to the game? I think there's a similar conversation we have in NASCAR when it comes to Michael Jordan's entry into it. I think some people will probably look around like, oh, this sounds cool, whatever else, but they don't understand that, Jordan is a North Carolina boy. They love that sport down there. And one thing that I learned, so I had the privilege of being able to take in the Daytona 500 in 2018, where Bubba Wallace came in second in one of the most thrilling finishes in NASCAR history. Austin Dillon just paced ahead of him. It was just a great race, great time. And there's so much talk about what that could have done for not just for him, but NASCAR for years have been trying to diversify their fan base. But the thing was, what I learned when I was down there in that week I was there was that they have a lot of black fans. They just never felt like they can be fully embraced into the NASCAR culture. They never felt like they could actually go to the track, obviously because of the presence of the Confederate flag, which is in a lot of places now been replaced by the flag of the current occupant of the White House. But I spoke to a lot of people who were down there. I spoke to some fans, but I spoke to some members of the some pit crews of some of the teams there. A lot of black folks who were involved in NASCAR itself. Mm-hmm. And they've said, like, we grew up in this sport. There are a lot of them who were Richard Petty fans, Dale Earnhardt fans, who love the sport, who got involved in it. But they never felt that there was a place for them. And NASCAR itself has been pushing for years. For the last close to 20 years, they've been pushing for it, which is why a guy like Bubba Wallace has been able to have the success he's had, because this has been a conscious push for them to get it. And despite some of the issues he may have at times with his car, this has been the best year he's had. I think he had, if I understand, like, 5 top 5 finishes. He's up in the top 20 in a lot of races. NASCAR is a hard sport to win one race in. So if you are able to have several top 5 finishes, even if you don't win a race, you've had a successful season, and you're a driver that some teams are going to look for.
So he's the right. He's the right guy. He's the right guy, both from image and from the potential for his breakthrough in performance to be aligning with the team that Michael Jordan is putting.
And absolutely, and that's the thing. Listen, that's what I'm saying. Going back to Jordan and his involvement, being a North Carolina boy, understanding that passion, because again, a lot of black folks do mess with NASCAR. They may not say it overtly. We may not have those obvious conversations to the same degree you have about team sports, but they want that. They want something, and the table was set based on even some of the political issues that came up with NASCAR this past season. With the noose, unfortunately. I think when NASCAR finally said to themselves, all right, we gotta get that flag out of here. Getting the Confederate flag out of here. You saw how suddenly when there were several tracks they were able to have fans, and you saw there was this gravitational pull that Wallace had. it was an incredible image right after the noose incident, and you saw all these black fans just greeting him and him taking in that love and all that. And you saw that. It's like, these people exist. They weren't just there to support, obviously they were there to support Wallace and to prove that, like, Black lives do matter. But they were also saying to themselves, like, we love this sport. And they wanted a chance to see somebody that looked like them perform well. And they've been able to see that. But now when you have an owner who can come in and looks like them, I didn't check the numbers exactly of all of the NASCAR owners, but he may be the wealthiest owner to come into the game. They've been waiting for somebody with that kind of money to come into the game, and for it to be Michael Jordan.
The crossover appeal of Michael Jordan is unmatched by any other marketer almost in America. When you just talk about an individual person and what they bring to the table,
he is the best. And I used to say this as a joke. He is the best marketed entity since Jesus Christ. And I'm not trying to be funny, but I don't think I'm that wrong.
Going down the John Lennon path there a little bit, but it's not wrong. It's not wrong. Here's the thing that's unique about Jordan being in NASCAR for me is that it calls me back to some things we've seen over the last 25 years or so. I remember how golf changed when Tiger went to the head of it. It just changed. The people that were involved in it changed. The embracing of it changed. More black people play golf now, I would venture to say, than at any other point in history because of Tiger being there. Whether it's reflected in the sport, in the PGA, in the PGA or not, that's not necessarily had, I think, the same impact that you might have expected from Tiger being in there. It certainly hasn't had the same impact that you've seen happen in tennis when you've seen the rise of the Williams sisters and things like that. Not that tennis was devoid of great blacks in the past, when you have people like Arthur Ashe and Althea Gibson and things of that nature who have been in the sport and have done what they needed to do in it and have already set down those pathways. NASCAR exists in a little bit different of a space, though, because it's not as if, to the points that you made, that we aren't a part of the sport, and it's not something that we've been invested in the past. It's something now that has a chance to grow some. And another guy I want to bring into the perception of that and the perception of racing in general is Lewis Hamilton. Having, fewer people, I think, in America watch Formula One than even watch NASCAR. Right. But the popularity of Lewis Hamilton is superseding that. And I would say
he's one of the most transcendent athletes in the world.
Absolutely.
It's incredible what he's been able to do.
I say all the time, is today's Tiger Woods. I mean, he just is that successful in his sport. He has that much crossover appeal. But the difference is that Lewis also is making it very clear of what side of the aisle he stands on when it comes to rights and things like that. So to have a Bubba Wallace, to have a Lewis Hamilton who stood up and wore and came under fire for supporting Breonna Taylor and bringing that image to the racetracks over in Europe, and to finally bring a Michael Jordan into it, it's tearing down what I think is probably the highest built tower of whiteness in sports, being away from other people. And it's taken that type of success of Hamilton, the persecution, if you will, of Bubba Wallace, and also the unapproachable stature of Michael Jordan to bring those things together.
And let me just say this again. This is why we do have to mention sort of the politics in this as well. For many years, Jordan himself was criticized for being quote unquote apolitical. And the line that he never really said, Republicans buy sneakers too. And he had been criticized that for years, and it can be legitimate because of some people who felt like he should have said more. Shout out to Craig Hodges, but he privately did a lot of work, and that came into the fold recently. He did donate to President Obama's fundraisers in both campaigns. He had done some private donations here and there, but that wasn't exactly played up.
The Malcolm X story. Went to Michael about Malcolm X. He put money into that.
Right. But it wasn't until, a couple years ago when he decided to, he finally said it for people. He finally said Black Lives Matter, if you will. He finally decided to put some donations up, really putting some money up. But he's continued to do that and tell people about it, which I think is a difference. He's telling people now what he's doing. And I think, whether
I think the
no
era
matter
of
what,
I think the era of the silent benefactor, the silent financier, when it
that's
comes to
ended.
things like that, that's over. You can't do
That's
it. And unfortunately, there's a lot of strength in doing that, and you can continue to do that. But some of your victories you got to claim. And
yeah.
Mike's in the situation where he has to claim them.
Michael,
Especially on the other side of something like The Last Dance, when so much of his success was put out there that you can't keep looking like you flew above all these other things that were happening. And I think the more of those stories coming out is important.
Absolutely. So like now that we're seeing this, and that's why, and shout out to Denny Hamlin, who's actually going to be his partner in this as well.
Which is important.
Yeah. You have a guy who knows the sport and who obviously has been trying to get involved in ownership for a long time, and he is young. And I want to talk about that in a moment. But, with Jordan sort of becoming more open about his political awareness and his social stature and all that, Wallace, who's already there, I think there's great support for them to bring in minority viewers, not just black folks, but just minority viewers in general. NASCAR has several minority drivers at the top circuit, and they definitely have a little bit more in the lower realms and all that. The female, the gender issue is still a tough thing for them right now, but they'll probably get back there with some of the young racers in the lower circuits. But I do think there is a lot to be said about this team now meeting this moment, NASCAR itself meeting this moment. They're going to get some backlash here and there, and I think there are going to be some people who believe that the Jordan team is a little bit of a cover for NASCAR in order to kind of break through to some other cases. But hey, you got to take advantage of what you got. But I do want to make this point with this team too, and I mentioned the youth, the relative youth of everybody involved. Wallace is, I don't think he's 30 yet. Hamlin in his early 40s, I think, if he's in 40 at all. Jordan, I think, has just turned 54, 55. I think it plays a massive role in terms of just determining if the team is going to be a success. The last person who came in from the outside of the NASCAR world, if you will, from another sport, to have built a team and had incredible success was Joe Gibbs. Joe Gibbs, when he got involved in NASCAR, he just finished a great run with the Washington football team. We have to call them that now. And he put in a good bit of money to build his team, and he's won several NASCAR, Cup championships, has been a contention for a number of years. He's built one of the top teams in the league, and he's been doing this over 2 decades now. But he was a relatively young guy doing this. I think he was just getting into like late 50s, early 60s. Jordan's a little bit younger and a little bit and a lot more money behind him. And I think I
just did an age check on that. Michael is 57 right now.
57,
turns
yeah.
58 in February. Bubba Wallace is 27 and Denny Hamlin is 39.
Yeah. See, the relative youth of this team plays a massive role here. And everybody understands how hard it is to win one race at the top circuit, let alone try to win multiple races. You're not going to have Jimmy Johnson. You're not going to have that kind of guy right away, but you are going to have a team that understands what it takes that it takes time and resources to win and win consistently, which is why I'm glad you mentioned Lewis Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton, he's had incredible success with Mercedes, but he didn't originally start with Mercedes. For folks who understand the racing world, you know that he got to start with a team called with the Williams team. Williams was considered a legendary, F1 circuit for a long time, and they've fallen on hard times over the years. But they had this really dynamic, young, interesting, and I'm comfortable enough to say this, good-looking young man who can actually get the attention of people beyond the sport. Williams had that. They just didn't have the same resources to allow him to succeed. Yeah. Now, Richard Petty's team has done everything they could to help Bubba Wallace succeed, but they didn't necessarily have the resources to have a consistently great car. Wallace is almost in the same boat as Hamilton. Again, the talent is there. It's been proven for a long time. Good-looking guy who can actually out of the sport itself to bring in people. He's the guy who could do the talk show circuit, in other words, when I mentioned, the appearance.
Yeah.
There's a similar wave that he can go through. He can be NASCAR's Lewis Hamilton, except we don't know if he can win consistently enough because that's hard to do.
That's the key. And that's the big key. I mean, Lewis Hamilton is
one of the most dominant athletes in the world.
I mean, when you talk about success, I mean, you're talking about Floyd Mayweather level success. You're talking about LeBron James being able to stay relevant at the top of finals, Tom Brady level success. I mean, Serena Williams, it's like Lewis Hamilton is one of the most dominant athletes in the world, period.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he's also has been one of the highest earning athletes in the world over the past 10 years. I mean, the only people that have regularly eclipsed Lewis Hamilton when it comes to earning, and I write a sports earnings column at the end of each year, it has been Floyd Mayweather, it has been Messi and Ronaldo, it has been LeBron James, and it's been Steph Curry. That's it. Those are the only people that have consistently out-earned Lewis Hamilton over the past 4 years. And that says a lot about that. And a lot of that comes from that Mercedes-Benz deal, which gets him upwards of about $40 million a year. But, I mean, he's at no short change when it comes to the finish line. I mean, he's running pole almost every week.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, it takes a lot to build a dominant team. Yes, hi, Ellis. Here's my son. All right, y'all want to meet my son here? Ellis, come here. Okay, you don't? All right, see you later. But yeah, it's. I think he just tied the record for most podiums in F1 history.
Yeah.
You know,
and he's creeping up on Michael Schumacher's wins record too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think people understand how incredible that is to do that, and he is not. He's still a relatively young man. You know, he's not. I think he's in his early 30s, mid 30s. I'm not sure about his actual age right now, but like he's still a relatively young man. If he chooses to dominate for another 7 years, he can.
He's 35. He's
35.
Time.
The guy can do this forever. He's incredibly fit. He has a great team around him. He can continue to do this, and I think that's where the comparisons are absolutely apt. There is a similar situation in terms of the infrastructure between both men. You're leaving teams that had strong prominence once upon a time, but they just needed a little bit more, and you needed somebody that was going to invest a massive amount of money into, completely into building the right team for you to succeed, to building the right car to succeed. You're having the right pit crew, you're having the right directors and all that stuff in order to succeed. When Hamilton joined Mercedes, it just took F1 to a different level in a way, in terms of reaching out to different audiences as well.
It absolutely ended the rivalry with Sebastian Vettel. I mean, it just put that into bed in a hurry.
Yeah, it put quickly. And, look, he's got guys on his own team that can probably try to compete with him, but he's just so much better, which is a lot to say. Wallace doesn't have the rivalry yet per se that would allow him to catapult himself that way. And I think that's the only other real difference between the two.
I would say this. I'd say this. I think he does. I think it's going to be a different type of rivalry, though, where Bubba Wallace is going to have a rivalry against the establishment. And I think that's going to be his primary one. Whether he's being a protagonist against it, he's shown that he has no problem being that if that's required, but it's just going to find its way to him. And that's what I look forward to with that. Jason, real quick before we get out of here, I want to hit a couple of things real quick. Three things before we get in and out. Number one, Kyrie Irving says he's finally playing with a guy that can close next to him.
Good for him.
In that thing. Fantastic for him.
It's just it goes back to, I think it's why LeBron said what he said the other day about him and Anthony Davis. Like there's no one-upsmanship. There's no petty. There's no, he made his comment, and I'm like, that probably is just all you need to know about that.
That's all you got to know. That's all you got to understand, and that's that.
But what's funny about that? What I'll say is what's funny about that is that, like, but it's Kevin Durant, who obviously is a closer, but Kevin Durant is probably hilariously petty in a lot of ways. So I love to see what's going to happen next season between those two.
It's going to be interesting. Another name I'm going to throw at you real quick. Shout out to Quinton Byfield, number 2 pick in the 2020 NHL draft, became the highest drafted African American. I'm sorry, he's
player. Yeah,
he's from Canada. The highest drafted Black person in the history of the NHL. That is a remarkable accomplishment. This is a guy who's got the ability to be centerpiece on a franchise and things like that, and he's going to get a fantastic opportunity to do so by being in LA with the LA Kings. This is a big thing. It's going to take time. Not everybody comes into the NHL as a superstar right away. The NHL finds itself in a fantastic place. Its top 2 picks being to the New York Rangers and to the LA Kings. There was no way that you're going to miss on that. Definitely big ups to Quinton Byfield coming out of Canada, the highest drafted Black player in NHL history.
He's an offensive talent. I mean, I think some people said like he has a potential to be almost Mario Lemieux-like, which could be, all right, let's not push it there yet. Let's give it some time. But the idea that, look, he was a consensus number 2 pick this past year. I watched some of his clips, and it's like, okay, I see why they got him. A lot of offensive talent. He's not the fastest guy, but he has some size. He has everything you need in order to move the team. He's compared to his teammate Kopitar down there. They feel like there's a similar sort of offensive game to them. And I think that's the difference with him. Like the black players that are coming into the league in the 70s and in the 80s were more defensive, more enforcer, if you will. We have such diversity now with the players of black descent that have offensive gifts as well as the defensive side of things, and he carries that on. Evander Kane is probably the best offensive black player right now. He has a chance to surpass that, which is saying a lot because Evander Kane is pretty damn good.
Yeah, league's in a great place right now. If he pans out, you've got PK Subban, who's absolutely one of the most popular players in the league. You've got Evander Kane, what he's doing with as far as speaking up for the rights of African Americans in hockey and things like that. Couldn't have been a better time for a guy like this to come along.
And Seth Jones is an outstanding player as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Somebody to keep on your radar and somebody to get behind. And he's in a market that is going to be very easy to do that in. Not in Ottawa. He's not in Winnipeg. Somewhere where he can be seen. And that's going to play a big role in this. Finally, last thing. We're at potentially the last day, finally, of the 2019-2020 NBA season when this show drops. Any quick takeaways on the NBA Finals and where we're at, and just maybe the bookend what we talked about last week.
I wish this was a closer series than it was, although Game 4 was really dynamic and all that, really a lot of fun. But you're not going to get a situation like it was a few years ago where teams going to really come back with 3-1 because the Heat does not have the horses in order to make that happen. But you know what? Maybe it's fitting that had LA to close this because the Lakers to close it out the way they are. I'm just happy this has gone off the entire bubble. No matter how this finals ends, I'm just really happy that it's gone the way it has, even with the Wildcat strike, a couple of weeks ago that was started by the Bucks. I'm just really happy it went off well. And, people can continue to play their culture war games when it comes to their viewership. It's bullshit. Listen, the NBA is in really great shape. I definitely see the Lakers closing this out. I hope it's a competitive game because, it's always great to at least be entertained by a competitive game. I would love to see Miami extend this because we need something else to watch next week.
Yes, that's the number one thing. That's the number one thing for me. I don't want
I don't want to end.
I want as many games as possible. We got kind of shorted by a couple of other series over there. It's going to be interesting to see. Obviously we can have another visit back to what it means on LeBron James' legacy, obviously, what it means for potentially the start of a legacy for Anthony Davis, but also what it means for the Miami Heat, because I think that no matter what coming out of this series, the Miami Heat have put themselves in a position to be viewed differently going forward, especially in a very complicated Eastern Conference scene right now. We'll get there. I'm going to leave you at this before we go. I had a thought. You tell me if it's completely outside of the realm of possibility. How would Jimmy Butler fit in with either the mid-'90s or late '90s Knicks based on what he's shown in this series?
Oh man, he'd be awesome. He'd be awesome. I mean, it'd be there'd be a little bit of mixes of the late Anthony Mason with I think some Derek Harper in them. I think it's easy to say like, Oakley or Starks or whatever else. I think it'd been a good mix of Mason a little bit with that edge and that versatility in terms of his offensive game. But I think also because he, when he's on, he's a really good defensive player, and Derek Harper really was the guy who got in your face. But he would have fit in just fine. And he would have been the offensive guy that Patrick Ewing needed. He would have been the guy that, would have been easily relied upon. But, culture-wise, it's not just – the thing about those 90s Knicks, it wasn't just that they were, this hard-nosed defensive team. They were the most – and I would argue even in worst cases right now with this current team, the Knicks are the most New York thing. They're almost a New York team of all our teams. And those 90s Knicks embodied what New York City was at that time, in particular, what Black New York City was. He would have fit in perfectly.
I think so. It just kind of struck me watching him the other day about that. All right, man. Well, hey, once again, Jason, let everybody know where you're at, what you got going on, anything that's coming up. Pub Corner, what's going on?
Hey, a Sports Scribe. Just find me on Twitter, a Sports Scribe. I don't feel like spelling right now, but a Sports Scribe. Just put the words together and make it one and have fun with it. You can find me there. Do a little more freelance work right now. You can check out the recent stuff I've done for Decider. I've done some stuff that was outside of the sports world as well, which is great. And hopefully I have a few things on the Sports Fan Journal in the next couple of weeks, a couple interviews, and really just check out everybody else, man. Like, if you want to support me, make sure you support the rest of the team too, man. Not just TSFJ, but obviously support the homie Matt. And going back to your earlier thing, don't just vote. Fill out the damn census. We'd really appreciate that. Just do that part too.
Participate in your democracy. It is still there, and it is waiting on us to do what we need to do in order to be the change we want to see.
Absolutely.
Jason, thank you, brother, for making the time for us again. You'll be back much sooner than even I think you realize.
That's most likely the case. And hopefully my son doesn't, he actually wants to meet everybody for the first time, at least, on YouTube. So, happy to be on, and glad that you gave me a spot to be on.
Yeah, always, brother. Thank you, man.
All right, be good.
All right, welcome back in for the end of the program here today on Scenario Sports. I couldn't go by this week, though, however, without paying homage to the recently departed, I would just call him a Cardinal great, but just a legend, period, in the sport of baseball, Bob Gibson. And I couldn't think of a better way to do that than to go to the whip, if you will, and to bring in somebody's probably going to become the show's wise old sage when it comes to things like this. My father, Terrell Whitener. How's it going? You good?
I'm good, champ. How are you?
Great, can't complain. So you're festive for this event, of course.
Absolutely.
I couldn't think of a better, a more appropriate way to do it, because obviously, before I spent my career and things I spent my time doing, I obviously could speak to Gibson, but I wouldn't even imagine how many times you've seen him play, and all of those things. So, how many years since your first ball game now?
This was my 55th Cardinal season.
So, that would go back 1960.
1965, my great-grandmother took me to my first game because she wanted me to see Willie Mays play in Old Sportsman Field, which would be Busch Stadium 1 for those people who know Cardinal Stadium history.
So, and that's the year, obviously that's the year the Cardinals were coming off of a championship in 1964.
Right.
Kind of Gibson's breakout year, I think, would probably be the fair way to put it. He was already, a firm, but early in his career, he was actually a reliever. And,
right.
But he definitely coming out of 64. He had that huge series in 64 and took the Cardinals over the Yankees and really was established as one of the top pitchers in baseball at that time. So, the thing I kind of just, wanted to get you on was just, hey, I can run numbers all day and, talk about wins and obviously talk about the 1.12 ERA season and everything he's meant since that time, especially for African-American pitchers and ball players in full. But, I'd rather leave it to you. So let's just kind of start. What was it like with Gibson in real time? Back when he was playing, peak of his powers, what did that look like?
Gibson was one of those must-see type of people. Growing up, my brothers and I, who I kind of shared my early years in baseball with, along with my great-grandmother, to be completely transparent. Gibson, we used to go to the game to see good pitching. It was really interesting. We would go to the game to see Mays and, and Frank Robinson and, and Hank Aaron and those National League powerhouses at that time. But most of the time we chose to go see pitching. So, young Steve Carlton, definitely Bob Gibson, on there. But going to see Gibson was almost like going to see the short version of a movie. Bob was going to have you out of there in an hour and a half. Where some people, were the game wasn't necessarily as slow as it is now because the strike zone was bigger and people were swinging at more pitches and, more balls were going in play because the strikeout wasn't such a big part of the game, except for when you saw the Gibsons and the Marshalls and those type of things. But Bob was must see. He was almost that event type of thing where every time he went out, you could see something special happen. on that. And even so much then, it wasn't necessarily about a whole pride thing or a cultural thing. It was just like, that man was on the mound doing his thing every time you saw him. If he lost, you were surprised. You'd be looking at each other like, how did that happen?
Right.
Right. On that, how did that happen? Or they messed up, and so that's kind of the way it was.
And I pulled it up and looked. So that 65 season you're talking about, that was actually, he was 29 that year. When you think a lot about, guys, you consider them to be younger and, and breaking in. I mean, Gibson was an all-star in 1962. That would be his first all-star season. But, he already was an elite pitcher. 65 was the first time he won 20 games. He'd go on to win 20 games 5 different seasons. But he really hit that stride, hit that prime in 65. It was the first of 6 straight all-star seasons that he'd have at that point. Really became just one of the elite guys in baseball. But you kind of make that mention about the pride and the moment of it. And obviously, being the age you were at that time, maybe the levity of seeing, a black pitcher at that time perform the way he did. But, we are, to that point, 55 years later, and Gibson, I think, is still a pretty big margin, the greatest African-American pitcher in Major League Baseball history.
Yeah, when you look at longevity and records and accomplishments, I still think he's at the top of the heap.
Yeah, I think that the argument still stands for many, that saw him. I'd probably put my grandfather and put other people in there to talk about Satchel Paige as not only being the best black pitcher of all time, but arguably being the greatest
maybe
pitcher.
The best pitcher, yeah,
and greatest showman, greatest pitcher, just everything.
Oh, yeah.
All time. But, I think the part that stands out the most for Gibson is that, you can look at all these people that won 300 games and did this and that, but, there's so much more to his legacy as a competitor, as a top flight pitcher. I don't think you can make an all-time World Series staff and not have Gibson be on it.
Oh, my gosh, no.
So, I mean, those World Series games, when you look at, what 67 and, and even 68 and what that looked like, what was that Gibson? Because some guys, some guys go to a different level when it's, winning time, if you will, and he was that guy.
Yeah, see, and again, as I said previously, I mean, like you said, he had to run 6 straight All-Star games. He was a perennial All-Star and stuff. But when the World Series came around, Matt, you got to remember the World Series was so big because it was exclusively played in the daytime. And the other thing about it is they would wheel the TV into your classroom to watch the World Series. So not only were you getting the St. Louis stopped and baseball stopped to really showcase those guys at that time. And when you're talking about 1967 and literally 1968 in the World Series in Gibson, they didn't stand a chance. Very recently in the last week, talking about tributes and things, they were talking about the fact that when he threw that famous Denny, they played an interview that they did with Denny McLain, who went against Gibson in game 1 in that series, the 17 strikeout game. And, and they were saying and McLain said, now I can tell you about Gibson as a pitcher, but I can also tell you that I had to stand in that box against him. And he at that time was bringing that slider, out of those white shirts. Because remember, in baseball games, everybody used to dress up to go to them baseball games, especially the World Series. All those businessmen would have on those white shirts, and he bringing that slider out of them white shirts, that white ball. And he said, you didn't even know. You were just guessing where it was at. You didn't see it, And then sometimes, people were saying, and Tony Perez was saying, that there were times when Gibson was right. You couldn't necessarily see what he was doing, but you could hear what he was doing. So that's Bob Gibson, at peak power. You heard trouble coming, but it wasn't a whole lot you could do with it.
And then in those 2 World Series that he won, I mean, it's just looking at his World Series line here, 2-time World Series MVP. He made 3 starts in every World Series that he was in,
Right.
So I mean,
Right.
That's 27 innings pitched in each World Series. So I mean, that's out of the 9 World Series starts that he made, he pitched 8 complete games.
Yeah.
92 strikeouts, 81 innings, 7-2 all-time record. I mean, that's just that's about as close to perfection as you can get. And even in the year that he lost, he only allowed 5 earned runs over 27 innings. So I mean, that's just, I mean, that legacy is so big. And when you talk about being in St. Louis and you talk about what it means to be a Cardinal fan, I mean, Gibson just stood. If Stan Musial is head, it stands over the rest of the history of the franchise. Gibson's no lower than his shoulder as far as being the legend of the organization.
Yeah, I mean, the thing of it is it was undisputed that Gibson was the second greatest Cardinal, of all time until, and we may be able to debate it, until number 5 showed up, and
Albert Pujols.
And would be an Albert Pujols. So, so that's a discussion that, different people could have. I know where I'm at on it. But I just always say that, for me, I mean, it is a great loss, and it's understandable because time waits on no one. But as far as the greatest Cardinal pitcher of all time, of a trendsetter and a person that you can be in the backyard, emulating, day after day after day. Gibson, and in the time that I grew up, Juan Marichal, because of his unusual, wind up and that type of stuff. But all of us, was Bob Gibson. All of us was Bob Gibson. And I'm sure that if you talk to people in other cities that really followed baseball, in my cohort group, in many cities, that they were a baseball fan, they were Bob Gibson.
Yeah, and you get that news just right on the heels of Lou Brock, passing, earlier in September. It's not even, not even a month apart. I mean, and those two guys are the engines that drove both sides of those teams. I mean, and it's a thing that it hits because you have that kinship with that team, and I think the kinship that the city of St. Louis feels with the Cardinals is a bit different than it is for some other cities with their baseball team. I mean, there's few I feel like few fan bases and teams, regardless of the sport, who are as intertwined as those are. It's not even, a thing where you have to be a fan of the league, but you are a Cardinal fan if you're in the city. So, Lou Brock and Bob Gibson and Sam Musial and, Ozzie Smith from my era for sure. I mean, it's for the era after me, if you will, Albert Pujols, Yadier Molina, the younger people like that, even though it's a little bit of a split, that's semantic. Those people mean things to those people. Red Shangies, Whitey Herzog, the list goes on and on and on. But to lose Brock in that same time and Gibson, it's a loss to the Black baseball heritage as well. That's just, a big thing. So, in addition to talking about, what it meant to see Bob Gibson and to that presence of Bob Gibson, which I think is probably the most, it's funny that he was that great of a performer, but that his presence almost has a bigger legend than even the results on the mound. I mean,
I think in a lot of ways it may be bigger.
Yeah, right.
I mean, Bob was
it's kind of like he's the Undertaker. Like, it's just like you feel the Undertaker when he comes around.
Yeah,
different thing.
Yeah, I mean, the thing of it is this, that every time something like this happens, Matt, it makes you, it almost recalibrates you to a point of celebrating greatness while it's there.
Sure.
I mean, because there's a certain amount of taking, not necessarily people for granted, because we saw these guys aging, and we understand the time.
And also gave them their appreciation every time that they took their head out. I mean, they got their love.
Oh my gosh. And, and Gibson could still communicate with people. I mean, just think about his relationship with Flaherty. I mean, and that's going to make, Flaherty, along with just being a gifted talent, it's going to stoke that fire, because just like he's going to take a piece of Bob Gibson to him, with him to the mound, even more so.
Well, and it's and the symmetry that's kind of, you talk about Jack Flaherty, and and it's just kind of crazy to think that Jack Flaherty's probably the second greatest black pitcher in Cardinals history, maybe.
Certainly that's
certainly,
crazy already.
I would
but
probably
true.
say number 3. I mean, because you've got Lee
Okay.
Smith, who spent his time here, and who's obviously a Hall of Famer and whatnot.
Yeah.
There might be a couple people missing in there, but when it comes to talent, I feel pretty confident saying 2 or 3, definitely.
Yeah, sure.
But he goes out and pitches the game that he pitched in the postseason on the day that Gibson passes. I mean, it's just kind of freaky how that worked out. Obviously, that didn't work out for the Cardinals to pick up the win, but I mean, Flaherty certainly did that, and I think Flaherty, without a doubt, felt that presence. I know they had a relationship, and I know that he had a lot to do with forming him, and that Gibson, saw things in him that he recognized and that he admired. And certainly, Gibson's admiration, there's no doubt about how Jack Flaherty and everybody else that came after him. I mean, he sits at the head of the table of the Black Aces, in baseball history, who are the, either the Cy Young winner or the 20 game winners, the 9 pitchers that have done that in MLB history that are African-American pitchers. But it brings up to a bigger question that one of our listeners sent to me and reached out to me and asked about. And he said, what MLB franchise has the best African-American players of all time, if you had to break it down and look at it? So, me, I took that as a reason to do a research project. So I did that. And I went into and to break down how I went through this is I just looked at the top 1,000 players in MLB history by WAR, along with a couple of people I know played for different franchises and moved them into it. And the takeaways were interesting when you look at it. And certainly the exceptional African-American players who stand out on their organizations are there. And there's a lot of franchises that have had that success. We talk about Lou Brock, we talk about Bob Gibson, we talk about Ozzie Smith. I mean, with the Cardinals, that's kind of the tip of the iceberg. The Cardinals have been, as far as when you talk about depth, they've been one of the richest franchises in African-American players. You go to an MVP like Willie McGee, just Curt Flood, everything he was on the field. Let's not even talk about what he did off of it. But one of the most gifted defensive center fielders and a 300 hitter of all time. Bill White, Ray Langford, Lee Smith, just a lot of guys that are there.
Vince Coleman.
Terry Pendleton.
Those guys.
Just Lonnie Smith. A lot of guys. You could go on and on.
Sure.
But, so I put together a list of some franchises that stood out among the other ones for me. And I just want to throw a couple of teams out and just kind of get your thoughts about them, because you've seen a few of these things. And maybe at the end we'll decide which ones we think has the bigger thing. So I think the team that stood out to me that my head went to right away, and I mean, I just think that you think about them right away, is the Dodgers. Jackie Robinson, Roy Campanella, the first, the greatest black catcher in MLB history for sure. Don Newcomb, the first Cy Young winner. You've got other guys like Willie Davis and Dusty Baker, Al Downing, Mookie Betts being there now. There's more. I mean, I'm sure there's. I know I'm missing.
Missing Maury Wills.
Thank you. There you go, Maury Wills. Thank you.
On that, I mean, and that's that's, they were very important, at that time, because before there was Ricky, before while there was Lou, Maury Wills was his competition in the National League, while Aparicio in the American League, weren't as much in stealing bases in. But Maury was a headache. Maury was a triple every time he got on, on the bags, on that. So I mean, and that's and so another franchise that stood out for me while putting this together. And I tell you what, one that really came strong, the Cincinnati Reds. Frank Robinson, Joe Morgan, Ken Griffey Jr., Barry Larkin, George Foster, Reggie Sanders, Ken Griffey Sr., Ron Gant during his time there. I know I'm missing some people, and they've got another young black guy that's coming up. I'm sorry, Eric Davis. There we go. That's Aaron Davis.
About, but when you look at that list, you've got 3 MVPs in the Reds uniform right there, in Robinson, Morgan, and Larkin.
And the interesting thing about the Cincinnati Reds then is, I mean, they just kept it rolling. I mean, they made a huge misstep, when they got into that salary dispute with Frank, and Frank just took that, and you talk about stoking the fire. All he did the first year after they traded him was went over to the American League and won the Triple Crown,
Yeah,
and the MVP. But you know what? But for anybody that knows Frank, that doesn't surprise me, on that. Because if you talk about people with an edge, and and someday, whether it be on your podcast or my podcast, we'll get on and talk about just how fortunate I've been directly and to a certain extent you indirectly through that have been to have the relationships and be able to have the pass-throughs with some of the people in this game that I have. But when I think about people with edges, and it's funny that whenever I talk about Frank Robinson, I just always say Frank, because that's the relationship that that we had. And but when you talk about people with edges, you talk about Gibson, you talk about Frank. Another guy that we don't talk about that played with an edge, and a lot of people don't really talk about him that much, is Billy Williams. Billy wasn't no joke. I mean, Billy played with that edge.
And that's another franchise that certainly has that thing in the Cubs, and Ernie Banks, Andre Dawson, Billy Williams. Derek Lee, who's a little bit of an underrated contributor for his time. Lee Smith, another Hall of Famer who really cut his teeth there. Jason Hayward being there now, who certainly is an accomplished pitcher there. Ferguson Jenkinson being a black man, but being a Canadian, and this being a Canadian, an African American list, but on semantics, I'm not going to hold that against Fergie. Put him on this.
I was just as I said that, I was thinking, Fergie, I'm trying to sneak him in. So
I'm particular about my orientation.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah,
but then you talk about the Orioles. I mean, you got Frank Robinson, Eddie Murray, Harold Baines, Adam Jones. I mean, another one. Not quite at the level that made the cut of these Dodgers and Cardinals and the Reds, but another organization that came really strong and really had a lot of guys. The Pittsburgh Pirates.
Oh my gosh.
Quiet as kept. The Pirates have had 4 African-American MVPs, more than any other franchise, between Barry Bonds, Willie Stargell, Andrew McCutchen, and Dave Parker. That's impressive. Then you also have to add in Bill Matlock and Bobby Bonilla, and just all of the different people they had there. The time they ran the 9 black players out at once, I mean, that takes up a whole slot right there. That hadn't happened before and hasn't happened since in Major League Baseball history.
Right.
That's a remarkable thing to see, and that's one of the most exceptional but underestimated moments in MLB history.
Yeah, I mean, because even you got to remember that baseball was almost living in 2 realities, some in the 60s, because the American League cities were a little slower to come to a lot of African-American players in some instances. I remember having the privilege of because I got to see both leagues, as because I used to visit your great grandfather who lived in Detroit, a lot. So I got to see American League Baseball before there was interleague, and I got to see a Willie Horton with the Tigers and Lou Whitaker, and then Frank and those guys would come to town, and those Oriole teams that I was lucky enough to be there with that, with an all-black outfield, Matt, which was kind of like, whoa, because Don Buford and Paul Blair, and Frank were out there in the outfield, a lot of the time. So, we've talked before about black catchers because you had Elrod Hendricks catching on that team.
Which is a rarity, which is something
so there's so many, man. That that's what makes baseball gives new birth every year, and that's the reason why I can be a fan 55 years later and wake up to new hope every spring and new anticipation every spring.
So 2 more teams that kind of made this elite cut that I had here, and then kind of talk about the one that we think maybe stepped out the most in both of our eyes. It's how do you do a list of greatness in the game and not mention the New York Yankees. You talk about American League teams that came around, but when you look at some of the guys that have come across there, obviously Derek Jeter, Reggie Jackson, Ricky Henderson, Dave Winfield, Willie Randolph, CC Sabathia, Giancarlo Stanton, Ken Griffey Sr., Elston Howard, Al Downing, Aaron Judge. You've got another strong player there right now in Aaron Hicks.
Aaron Hicks, yeah.
And the thing about the Yankees is, and I put this list together by saying people have spent at least 5 years with the franchise. The Yankees are a team that a lot of the time people make pit stops with or sign with later on in career, started somewhere else, or and things like that. But I mean, that's just an impressive collection of guys that have contributed to different eras of their legacy and things like that. And obviously Jeter sitting at the head of the table, but Reggie Jackson and what he did in the World Series, and Willie Randolph really being underrated to some extent about what he did throughout his career and the depth he had to it. The last team that kind of made this elite cut for me were obviously the San Francisco Giants. Ooh. And it's just because, I mean, anytime that your franchise is bolstered by Barry Bonds and Willie Mays, that's a pretty nice place to start from. Let's put it that way. Willie McCovey, Bobby Bonds, Monty Irvin, Sam Jones, Kevin Mitchell. There's just, and the list goes on from there. But I mean, Bonds and Mays, you probably could just play with two outfielders.
Yeah, but Willie was gonna talk about you though, because Willie loved the game, but Willie wanted the game played right, so.
True. Well, Bobby would have brought Bobby out there. That's probably the
strongest. He would, but you know what? Until it was too late, Bobby wasn't going. Willie wasn't going to move nowhere for him, because it's like, hey, putting young Bonds in them legs out in center field, and it's like, no, you're not.
No. If we're starting a team and I'm playing center field, if I'm running a center fielder out there, I'm taking Willie Mays. That's the start of that conversation and the end of that conversation.
Yeah.
So for me, when I look at this list, man, you can definitely go depth. You can go top tier talent. For me, quite honestly, and how I feel about Jackie Robinson. I mean, that doesn't go into any question. He's the answer to my, if you could have dinner with anybody ever, who would you do it? It's always Jackie Robinson for me.
Wow.
It's just so much to that we didn't get from him. But boy, I'd love to just have that conversation. Yeah. For me, quite honestly, I'm going to go with the Reds. When I look at Frank Robinson and Joe Morgan and Ken Griffey Jr., now granted, I'm not getting that Ken Griffey that was in Seattle, but it's still Ken Griffey Jr. And then Barry Larkin, that's 4 MVPs right there. Yeah. And I think, that's, what, I take it back. I'm sorry. I take it back.
So you tapping out already?
Yeah, this is hard. This is like picking between family for me, but
okay.
I'm gonna go. I'm sorry. I'm gonna go with the Cardinals. I just think the Cardinals have got between the greatest black pitcher of all time, in my opinion, the greatest defensive player of all time, and Ozzie. You've got Lou Brock, who's just done everything he's done. The impact of Curt Flood. It's close. But I'm going to go with the Cardinals for my choice. Surprise, surprise. I'm sure somebody's going to take it.
Yeah. Says, oh, wow, Matt with a revelation. Okay.
And for me, it's more about depth because, honestly, I think that the Giants' top talent, obviously, you've got 2 of the top 3 players of all time in Bonds and Mays. That's hard to overcome that. But the depth of what you've got with the Cardinals, I think, is impressive for me.
Yeah, you know what? And one of my favorite players of all time, Curt Flood, when we started to take the synergy between on-field greatness and helping to shape the game.
Impact.
See, because the reason why when I looked at this list, I was kind of vacillating between the Cardinals and the Dodgers. Because of how Campy did what he did, how Robinson, and everything he means to the game, how the impact that Newcomb had. Now, see, we also have to understand that when we start to talk about waking people up and commanding respect for African-American players too. I think Don Newcomb isn't talked about as much,
He should be.
Out there, but he should be because he was unapologetically Don Newcomb,
Well, and I'm gonna tell you what the tilting point is with this Dodgers team too, where you could easily make. I would have no problem if anybody said the Dodgers in this case.
Sure.
Mookie Betts has a lot.
He's gonna be. Oh my gosh.
He's got a lot more tread to go on it. And he's got every bit of the talent to be one of the greatest African American players of all time if he is not already in there. I mean, when you start to talk about breaking out this list into top 10s, I firmly expect for Mookie to be in that top 10 by the time he's all said and done. I think that when you look across the sports world right now, when you look at the stars that make it up, Mookie is one of the ones that's the most missed in plain sight of any of the true superstars of sports right now.
Yeah, and I tell you what will be the impact of Mookie. Mookie is where he wants to be, doing what he wants to do. He's got his career settled earlier than most other superstars, in this game, on that. I mean, Andrew McCutchen for years in Pittsburgh was sitting in that spot, and it showed in the way he played and what he produced, on that. But with Mookie, with the contract he has, with the platform that he wants to have both on the field and off the field, on that, he got his thing settled a lot earlier than most guys did in their prime.
Sure.
I mean, Barry did a great job of kind of charting his path too, because when it was obvious that he couldn't stay in Pittsburgh any longer, he went to his godfather and said, hey, let's make this happen out there.
Well, and you know the story about that though, how he almost was a Brave.
No, I don't think I knew that.
He almost was a Brave instead of going to the Giants. He would have been the hammer that was in the middle of that lineup with the young Chipper Jones and Maddox and Glavine and all those guys on the mound. Like the National League narrowly missed a nuclear missile if Bonds would have ended up on those teams.
Can you imagine him hitting in that park too?
Oh God, yeah. So I mean, and we would be remiss if we went through all this and we didn't mention the Braves, Hank Aaron, Fred McGriff, David Justice, Dusty Baker, Ron Gant, Jason Hayward again. They were a team that was one of the last great teams that had that many, prominent African Americans on a winning ball club. What they did, I mean, Marquise Grissom passed through there. There's so many different guys. Shout out to some of the recent MVPs and Jimmy Rollins and Ryan Howard in Philly. Dick Allen in Philadelphia, in Philly. I know that's San Diego. Not a lot of just great players all time, but the two great black players they've had, Tony Gwynn and Dave Winfield. Great start, great representatives at the table. For that.
The interesting thing about when we start to talk about growing up with black baseball, and when I think about how cool and how fortunate I was to start falling in love with baseball when I did. Our economics and what we could afford worked out in our favor because, we used to determine whether or not we sat in the left field or the right field bleachers based on the player we want to be around. Pittsburgh is in, right field bleachers for Clemente, all right, or the left field bleachers for Stargell at that time. You couldn't lose, on that. You almost want to spend half the game in one and half the game in another, to be within, and we wouldn't dare shout, hey, Hank, to Mr. Aaron, when there, but to say that I was able to sit, in the bleachers and, and watch him do his thing, for, those things. I mean, those are things, man, that just deepens the core of what you loved about it, and that's the reason why the All-Star game used to be such a big thing, because I could really root for them, for that day.
For a day, right.
for a day, because I don't want them to ever win, when I see them again.
Well, I know that I felt privileged to grow up with, a great black superstar in Ozzie Smith in town, always was appreciative, to see people boo Barry Bonds and to know what it was for, and why he was being booed. To see Tony Gwynn the greatest batting. People talk about Mark McGwire, talk about all those things. You ain't seen batting practice until you saw Tony Gwynn hit it. You never saw Tony Gwynn hit batting practice. You missed out on something.
Yeah.
And I think that before we wrap up here, it's important to realize that this is just, a lot of this is just the peak of the mountain. Think about all the names that are missing from those great lineages of those franchises. Let's just, say that Oscar Charleston would have played for the Oakland A's.
Sure.
Or, Buck Leonard ends up playing for the Pittsburgh Pirates. Or,
Sure.
You've just got all of these guys. Pop Lloyd is in the same infield as Honus Wagner in Pittsburgh. What does that mean? What would that look like? If Satchel Paige is pitching for the Cleveland Indians when Bob Feller was pitching for the Cleveland Indians. I mean, instead of, being there later, being there in the early parts of it, just how much of the dominance and how different the record books would look, which is why I don't agree with the people that say there's an asterisk on records for baseball before 1947, because I don't like to think that I don't believe personally in Major League Baseball, the history of it is always reflective of all the people that were involved in it. There were some people that played where they played, but I also and didn't agree with Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who, by the way, last week had his name removed from the MVP award, which was way overdue. And I think about how many great black players have won that award and have to have it with his name on it. It still is, those are the subtle institutional things that you see people act like don't exist, but it's there. And those are the things that need to be scrubbed from history so that you can properly give people the respect that they need and deserve to get. But, the Negro Leagues, I mean, when you look at what they meant and the path that they set and the things like that, on one half of me looks at it and says, boy, this record could look a lot different if Josh Gibson played for the Pittsburgh Pirates. But I'm glad that he played for the Pittsburgh Crawfords instead, because that's an important piece of history that was there. And although segregation caused it, in that instance, segregation created something uniquely black and uniquely important in the history of the sport too. So I don't feel bad about that.
Well, see, and I think one of the things that I look at, and again, I had the benefit of being introduced to baseball by my great grandmother, on that. And the thing that I can imagine about the Negro Leagues was, you could sit in those box seats behind the dugout, where you wouldn't have been allowed to, if those guys would have been playing, for other teams. So I can't, we could only imagine the social strata that they had to navigate. Yeah. But those Negro League baseball games, they were full citizens of those games. Okay. They didn't have to defer to anybody on that time. And the other thing that I think we got to continue to remember, and I know I'm not losing this on you, Matt, there's a lot of white folks that attended Negro League baseball games.
Oh, absolutely.
But when they did, they were just interspersed in the crowd with everybody else.
True.
So it was only a certain type of mindset that went to those games. So, but baseball is just, great. And, Mr. Gibson, like I said, just, well done. And, and there's just so many stories, and there's almost a wistful irony in Lou and Mr. Gibson going so close together, because those names were always in the same sentence,
right?
When we talk about the Cardinals, so they lived in the same sentence, and they almost passed away, in the same sentence. And there's a certain sort of rhythm, and of course it would be that way, that goes, to that.
Now, I tell you what, the Field of Dreams just got a lot more competitive with those two moving up to it and burning up the bases and keeping guys off the plate. And I think that's a apt place to mention. Last week we had Chris and Christian Little on. Obviously, Christian is one of the great amateur, getting ready to be collegiate ball players in the country. He goes to the baseball showcase this weekend, strikes out the side in the one inning he's got. So, as Gibson leaves, and we talk about Jack Flaherty and the things he's done, and you can still see what Mookie Betts and all those guys are doing, and in the postseason right now, the flame lives on, and that's a great thing about it.
Oh, so, that's the cool thing.
So, hey, I appreciate you making time to go down memory lane with us here and to recall, certainly I know, a couple of players in that instance, and a few other names I know played a big part in your life and have shaped your experience. So thanks for being part of the show today.
Yeah, not a problem. I enjoyed it, and and I hope everybody out there enjoys it as well. Take care.
So, all right. So that brings us to the end of the road today. I want to thank Jason Clinkscales for joining us early on to talk through the world of sports. Thank my father, Terrell Whitener, for joining us here to talk on the back end about, some of the history of baseball and history of Black baseball. As always, check out all the programs that are on the SOLC network. We've got new episodes of We're Coming For You that's dropping. We've got new episodes of Scenario dropping soon, and we have new episodes of Commentary dropping soon. I'm Matt Whitener. I'll see you back here again next week on Scenario Sports.